So if mothers aren't aware that they're HIV positive, then they weren't taking medication that prevents that. But there is medication that you can take if you're a mother who's HIV positive, so that you can give birth to a child who is not HIV positive, who's a healthy child, if you know. It's also very commonly transmitted through needle sharing, so that people who inject drugs with needles, if they share the needle with someone else, there'll still be some blood and fluid inside the needle, and if they share it quickly, then it's possible for the AIDS virus to be transmitted from one person to another person. It's very rarely transmitted through saliva, so kissing almost never transmits HIV. So you can kiss someone with AIDS all day and you'll be fine. Good news, right? Biting also usually does not transmit HIV. Very rarely. I think there's only been like 2 or 3 cases in the world, right, where someone has contracted HIV through being bitten by someone. It's very hard for the virus to live outside of the human body for very long. Some viruses can, but HIV is very weak outside of the body, and so if you're sharing food with someone who's HIV positive, you won't catch anything. So I've eaten with many people who have HIV/AIDS, and I'm perfectly healthy, right? You can't get it from toilet seats because it can't live outside of the body. You can't get it from swimming pools. So you could swim in a pool full of people with HIV and you'd be completely fine, right? So it's really only very specific things that transmit HIV. And so it means that if you know, once you know how it's transmitted, it's easy to protect yourself. Because basically, it just means you have to have a condom when you have sex with anybody, and that if you are going to inject drugs, you need to use a clean needle. And if you do those things, you're safe. I mean, it's quite simple. So what the information that I've just given you, which I think probably some of you knew already, is information that saves people's lives once they know it. But if they don't know it, it's very hard for them to protect themselves. Nurses and doctors can protect themselves by using what are called universal precautions, which means that no matter who is sitting in their office, they treat that person the same way. So if there's blood, they put on rubber gloves, and then they're okay, right? Doesn't matter whose blood it is. Doesn't matter if it's my blood, or Professor Adrianus's blood, or a drug user on the street's blood. They always use the gloves, and then they're protected, and they're safe. And so this is the way that HIV is transmitted, and this is why it's so critical to have information. So I'm now going to talk about the ways in which, because I'm sure you're wondering, when is human rights going to come into this, right? Where is the connection? So once you know how it's transmitted, you can protect yourself. And so one of the most basic human rights that is critical to preventing the spread of AIDS is the right to information, right? The right to information, which every human being in the world has that right, to know how HIV is transmitted and to know that if they use condoms, if they use clean needles, then they'll be safe. And it's especially important for young people who are most likely to be having sex, to be having it with multiple partners, and to be doing it, without careful protection. So governments have a responsibility to share that information. It is the job of governments to share that information with the people so they can protect themselves. And in some countries that doesn't happen. Second way in which human rights comes into HIV/AIDS is, as I mentioned earlier, the right to health. So everybody has a right to the highest available standard of health. And the problem is that AIDS medications are expensive because international pharmaceutical companies can make a lot of money from them. And so I did a report for Human Rights Watch a few years ago that documented how people with HIV/AIDS across the country were being turned away from hospitals. So the hospital would accept the person, because you can't see if someone's HIV positive, right? Anybody could be. You can't tell. You can have the HIV virus for years before you even start to look sick. And so they would let somebody walk in. They would give them a test for HIV without telling the patient that they were giving them that test. Then if they found the person was HIV positive, they would say, "I'm sorry, we can't treat you." And they would turn the person away. And this was happening around China, around the country. And so those people are being denied their right to health by government-run hospitals, right? So that's a second way. So first way, access to information. Second, the right to have access to health. Third is that women and girls are very vulnerable to sexual violence in many places. If the government doesn't take active enough steps to prevent or to prosecute cases of rape or cases of sexual violence, then women are very vulnerable to receiving HIV through sexual violence, and that happens in many places. The fourth way, and probably the most complex to understand, is through the lack of protection for rights of people who are marginal, the people who are most vulnerable, the MSM, the IDU, the SW, right, the sex workers. So in a country, in many countries this is the case, where drug users are likely to be beaten and thrown in jail just for being drug users, or where sex workers are beaten and jailed because they are sex workers, these are people who then are more likely to be driven underground. So if you know that the police are likely to throw you in prison, if you know that the police are likely to jail you and torture you, then you're not likely to go to any kind of government program that would give you information about AIDS. You're not likely to trust any NGO that comes to you saying, I want to talk to you about your drug use and I want to give you a clean needle. Because you're afraid that those people may inform on you and turn you over to the police. And this has happened, for instance, in the US, where we have programs to distribute clean needles to drug users. It's not to encourage them to use drugs, it's to stop them from spreading AIDS, stop them from sharing needles. So they give out clean needles, and the police will wait right outside the door. So you go in, you get your clean needle, you come out, and the police arrest you, right?
The same thing happened here.
Same thing happens here, yeah.
One of the university program was doing some action research work around the street, the main street here in the city of Depok. The police raid that place.
Really?
They're raiding because they suspected this health center, they call it, was the source of illegal market of drugs. But the truth is that the place was gimana caranya tempat penyuluhan bahasa Inggrisnya.
Rehabilitation center.
A rehab center.
Rehab center.
Yeah, right.
For
right.
the IDU.
Yeah, yeah. That's very
That's what
frustrating.
happened here.
Yeah, yeah. That's very interesting.